Yeah. So this session is being recorded. You already know that. Thank you very much for joining us today. My name is Pamela Katic. I'm a researcher at the University of Greenwich, and we are having very interesting discussions which started in the previous panel, which was on the same topic. And thank you for those of you that came back, and welcome to the new faces. So how we're going to run the session. We're going to have first 2-minute speeches on summarizing the contributions. So we have Tanya first and Tara after. Emma cannot join us. Unfortunately, she's ill, so she sent her apologies. Then we are going to open the floor for some Q&A and have a roundtable discussion. So I'll just raise my hand when the 2 minutes are up. So I'll give the floor now to Tanya. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So Luminary is the name of an initiative developed by Indigenous Works, which is a Canadian Indigenous owned and operated sort of research think tank. So Luminary intends to advance a 5-year strategy for Indigenous innovation as a catalyst for economic transformation, employment, and well-being. So the sort of primary vision of Luminary is to be the most impactful Indigenous-led network and program of its kind in the world, where academia and Indigenous businesses grow research and innovations for commercial and well-being success. So Indigenous people in Canada want to transform their economies and achieve well-being, and they list secured employment, more business development, wealth creation, community well-being, and better quality jobs as amongst their sort of greatest aspirations. These economic aspirations, however, are balanced with Indigenous goals for personal and community well-being, a quality of life in alignment with Indigenous worldviews and values. In Canada, the current strategies for Indigenous business and socioeconomic development are not working fast enough. And so in 2021, so 2021, a partnership of over 150 organizations was convened to examine ways of strengthening Indigenous research and innovation. And that's this Luminary project. And these partners include 70 post-secondary academic institutions from all across Canada, more than 50 Indigenous businesses, and 20 plus NGOs. And the Luminary partners identified 8 impact themes that collectively make up the Indigenous research and innovation ecosystem. I won't list them all, but growing research collaborations, growing Indigenous research talent, and creating knowledge transfer and mobilization strategies are kind of chief among those priorities. So in sum, this 150 partners in this Luminary initiative agree that research and innovation needs to be embraced as a fundamental driver for next generation pathways to achieve accelerated and transformative Indigenous economic development, employment, and well-being.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Tanya. Definitely a very exciting initiative that I think we all very much enjoy to read about and to see how it's developing. Excellent. Okay, Tara Corti, welcome.
Thank you. Yeah. So the title of my paper is Deepening an Ethic of Decoloniality in Research Partnerships, the Agentic Actions of an International NGO. So what I'll be doing is I'll be just sharing some of the learnings which Christian Aid, that is the organization I'm talking about, Christian Aid's learning and reflections when it undertook various actions to ensure that the research partnerships which it had were decolonial and equitable. Our first learning was that there is a need for greater attention to reflexivity. And to aid this process of reflection, we developed a set of questions which we felt would help the various actors in research partnership to think deeply about their own role and work in partnership. For example, the first question was, who do you listen to and hear from the most? So which are the voices that you're really listening to when you are carrying out research collaboratively? The second question for reflection was, which are the voices you hear the least? Yeah. And the third set of question was, whose voices, views, ideas do you need to include in your work, but you can't? And then it leads to another question, why? Why is it that you cannot include certain voices and certain ideas in your work? And we believe that these three reflection questions can help the various actors in partnership to move towards a process of having epistemic humility, to understand and recognize that perhaps in their own work of research, of working collaboratively with other partners, there are some voices and ideas and some frameworks which are not getting acknowledged or being spoken about. We also feel the community with which the research is engaging with needs to be recognized as an equal partner, and the voice of the community needs to be centered as well if we are talking about epistemic justice and reducing the power asymmetry in the knowledge production process. Some of our other key learning was, oh God, okay, I'm sorry, Pamela.
2 minutes goes really fast. I feel
Okay,
awful cutting you
yeah,
there.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, great. So if there's any specific questions for our two speakers from the audience or from anyone, I think otherwise we can jump into the roundtable discussion and continue a very enriching discussion. I'm going to give the floor to Michael. Michael, would you like to come in?
Thank you. Well, these are wonderful discussions, how they build on the previous session. Maybe they give us examples, really, or important case studies for thinking about what partnerships look like in their complexity. So I wanted to sound you out a little bit. And Luminary, for example, I think is very interesting because, well, in its own right. Also, we often think about research as being a group of people in universities and Indigenous people as kind of polarized, and as though the financing vehicles are kind of in the background, whether it's the research councils. And I often wonder whether the research councils need to decolonize. And so I'm quite interested in what reflexivity, to draw on one of the 9 competencies that Tanya, that your projects, what that looks like actually in relationship to funding and finance across institutions. Might start with that.
Yeah, that's a great question. And interestingly, a couple of the participants in this big study are Indigenous-owned financial investment drivers. So they're looking to the communities themselves for community-driven business opportunities and then looking to finance those. So, so in terms of the reflexivity, in the model that came out of this work, all those competencies are sort of work on one another, and the reflexivity along with willingness and vulnerability were kind of the key drivers for how we're seeing whether partnerships can be successful over the long term or not. And so it's, it's very difficult. In Canada, those big funding agencies are now beginning to recognize that their priorities need to adhere to the community priorities. And so that is happening. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but yeah, the gap that Luminary is trying to fill is just that. We're trying to get the communities to think about what they want to innovate and then bring the funders in, to that research, rather than it coming from the funders saying, okay, there's this pot of money for this kind of study or that kind of study. One of the really cool things that Luminary is considering doing is providing a matchmaking service. Mm-hmm. So Indigenous communities now in Canada are very familiar with the research process and are generating research ideas and research topics, which are then going to be sort of folded up into this space where funders and academics can match grad students or postdocs to address these very specific research needs of the community. So that's kind of one of the services Luminary is going to provide. So anyway, I'll stop talking, but yeah, I hope that answered your question to some degree.
Very interesting. I think on touching on kind of emerging structures within research that are quite new. And Tara, you've in the chat, but maybe to come into the forum now, you said something quite important. Could you say a little bit more about what decentralization looks like in relation to Global South partners.
Yeah. So this is the what I have put in the chat is based on a learning from a project which we ran in Christian Aid, which was called ESIT, and it is there in a presentation. But what we felt was that there is a lot of value if one makes an attempt to decentralize budgets towards the Global South partners. We all know that usually budgets are held centrally in the headquarters, but we do feel that an attempt needs to be made to decentralize budgets. And I also think connected to this is the aspect of the partnerships structure. The governance structure for the research. And we feel that in the larger governance structure for the research, what we need to have is a structure which is representative of all the partners in the research. Yeah, so I do think that the finance aspect, the budgeting aspect, and the aspect of how the project is being governed needs to be seen as something which is intersecting and not in silos. Yeah.
Very interesting. I wonder if anyone else would like to come in there, or
can I ask something? I'm sorry. I'm
Please,
curious now. So one, it's for Tanya, because she's saying that in Canada, it seems that the research councils are prioritizing also the needs of the communities. And I would like to know, because it's about institutional change, right? How do you see that this happened? And the second question that I have, well, it's like a comment, and that's also for all of you that have much more experience than me in writing grants and submitting proposals. When we want to say that we want to have meaningful relations with the communities or indigenous peoples, sometimes it's also about when we want to research the set the priorities, we need to spend time with the communities, defining what is what they want, discussing. But usually that's not considered in part of the whole research proposal writing. You have to sometimes come quick when the calls come, and there's not so much time for that. Do you see that changing in the near future or not? Or what is the actions that probably, or the responsibilities that we have as researchers to move that?
Sorry, was that directed at me specifically, or?
The first to you and
The first to me.
and the second to everyone.
So I can very briefly just say that in Canada, we're undergoing a period of quite transformative change when it comes to Indigenous peoples over the last sort of even 5 years. I've never seen, in my 25-year career doing this, I've never seen quite as much sort of synergy and kind of energy coming. And we have to give credit to where credit is due. This is after, decades, in some cases more than 100 years of fighting from Indigenous populations in Canada for recognition, whether that's legally, constitutionally. Canada has, as you know, recently legislated the United Nations Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous People. That is now having policy implications on the ground. So all of these sort of levers have been pulled in a quite an interesting way. That plus the federal government is pledging literally billions of dollars. I mean, Luminary is budgeted as a $24 million project initiative. So, there's just this sort of willingness. So that has come out of Indigenous persistence, resistance, resilience, and then a willingness sort of on the Canadian general populace to kind of recognize that and come together. And Canada also is a treaty nation. I mean, we have Indigenous peoples are and have always been part of that national narrative, whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. In varying terms, it's a complicated, but it seems to be moving the ball forward. Anyway, we finally feel like we're pushing against an open door for the first time. So.
Well, I have to say personally too, that's fantastic. Having spent a lot of time working with institutions in Canada, I think I reviewed quite a large program 10 years ago, quite a few millions of dollars. And of course, there was the check about which programs were collaborative, but it really tended to fall short, those conversations with the Research Council about many of the things we're discussing, particularly about prior consultation. And I don't quite know why they find it so difficult to build in funding opportunities that allow time for the kind of relationship building that's clearly already well recognized in a group like this.
Yeah, and I think that we kind of planted the seeds of these kinds of relationships 20 years ago, and we're sort of now seeing the fruits of those labors come, where people like me who have, been sort of professionally raised by Indigenous communities, those partnerships are starting to really gain ground and really kind of create something really special. So not just me, there's a lot of people in Canada who are doing this.
Yeah. That's very good news. So in the chat, there's another sort of aspect of this developing, isn't there, where Bhaskar's asked about what kind of constraints are there in terms of institutional structures about budgets and what funders' expectations are. Sarah, you've come back to that actually. So do you want to say a little bit more about language?
No, I mean, Jim and Sonia are both wanting to speak. I think my point is made in the comment in the chat. I'm happy to talk to people offline about that.
Thank you. Jim, you've been waiting.
Yeah, I think that I was so happy to hear Tanya talk about the legislation, the Canadian legislation now to implement the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, because I think that goes to, when we start looking at engagement, quite often, and correct me if I'm wrong, quite often, we say, oh yeah, let's engage with Indigenous peoples because they're one of the stakeholders. And I think that it's not just being a stakeholder, we're rights holders. And I think that there's the difference whereby stakeholders, it's nice and you should engage, stakeholders who are going to be impacted by the research. But when it comes down to Indigenous peoples, we're not only stakeholders, but we are rights holders, and that makes it compulsory to engage from what I see. And I think that there's, and I think someone's mentioned before that there's a risk element if you don't engage properly and in recognition of those rights. I've got to stop talking with my hands. But there is a risk, and the First Peoples Worldwide organization, they actually did a risk analysis of if you don't engage or if you exploit Indigenous rights, what are some of the risks to business and country risk as well. And we found that here in Australia with one where there was one Indigenous group on the Murray River, a small group. They complained to World Wildlife Foundation to say that there is no Indigenous involvement in forestry in Australia. World Wildlife took that to the UK government. The UK government put Australia on the less preferred list for forestry products, as did Belgium and others. And as a net result, we had to travel to the UK to convince them, and when I was manager of this National Indigenous Forestry Strategy, to prove to them that yes, there is. So the risk for us, quite often, may come from a small group that people may not have thought about, but there is that risk if you don't engage with the rights holders in an ethical way. I'll get off my soapbox now.
Yeah, Sonia.
I just wanted to go back to the discussion on trust and time in relation to two of the points that were mentioned, because what we were hearing and also our experience in working with communities is that in reality, the more you have an established relationship and the more that you have an entrusted relationship with the community, the more than the community will come back to you to say, oh, we need X, Y, and Z. So, and that's when it becomes like a circle. Yes, you go with whatever your interest might be, but at the same time, they have already established a relationship that they can come back to you and they can come back and ask for different things. And for me, the value of that is also linked to the discussion on funding, because I don't see as a problem that for some funding, you might not have time to establish the relationship, because I think that that's good, because you need to have an established relationship. Otherwise, we go back to all the difficulties that we have been criticizing about, extractive research or parachuting into places that you have never heard about. So it's more for us to change our minds in terms of saying, well, if I want to do X I need to plan ahead 3 times or 3 years before, even if I know that I don't have funding, because that's not going to happen soon. And in Australia, we also have seen, this is in relation to one of the last points in the previous session, was that increasingly there are more and more communities that have already established their own protocols, and that's come like very much at the front of the discussion, very clearly at the beginning, saying, well, you know, we are kind of fed up of this, so if you want to work with us, these are our conditions, and that's it. And sometimes it becomes even very formal, that you have to sign agreements or agree in something that it's going to be there, and they will refer to that in the future as well. Thank you.
Tara, I wondered if you wanted to elaborate on the point in the chat about whose ethics, whose informed research partnerships.
Yeah, thank you, Michael, for giving me this opportunity. So what I wanted to share is that we have been reflecting on the approach to research ethics, which is usually taken in, in research partnerships or conventional research. So we have been asking ourselves that whose ideas of research ethics are we advocating, whose understanding of what is harm, what is risk, what are benefits, and what mitigation strategies need to be put in place. And this kind of reflection is also arising from some of the innovative work which one of our partners in India has carried out. And what that particular partner did was it made a move towards what they called as a community ethical process, a review process which is driven by community and which is community centric. So for a research project which they were implementing, and that research was very community centric, what they did was that they nurtured and formed collectives at the community level, which were given the responsibility, which had the responsibility of reviewing the ethical protocol of that particular research project. And it came up with various interesting findings that it is not that there are no dynamics involved in this process, that when a community collective is engaged in the process of looking at the ethical protocol, there are various dynamics involved. For example, in the Indian context, what it was seen that the dynamic of caste was also percolating in the work of that particular collective. Yeah, so what we are saying is, at one level, we are saying that we are trying to reduce the power asymmetry, or we are trying to deinstitutionalize the ethical review process. But the experiences at the field also show that there are certain power asymmetries which can arise at the ground itself. These are very initial experiments, and I do admit that this, apart from the Indian partner, the other partners in Christianate have not been able to do this kind of innovation. But I do feel that there is merit in exploring this and seeing whether the community itself can be engaged in a more deeper manner in identifying what are the risks, in identifying who can participate in the research, who cannot participate in the research, because we definitely feel it should not be just the research team which decides what are the exclusion criteria, and certain people are excluded because they are considered as being high risk. So we do feel that, this whole pushing that we consider some people or some groups as coming into the high risk category, and hence they cannot be part of the research. Perhaps there is a need to further reflect upon it. Yeah, thank you.
Tanya, I wonder if you want to take the chair, lead the discussion.
Yeah, I think I see a hand up, Reina. Please go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to pose a question, I think, in relation to what Tara was just saying about ethics, and also to what Tanya was saying in the previous session about equitable, creating that equitable space of power dynamics. I know that in Australia, when you're conducting research with Indigenous communities, there's always that sense of trying to build those equal relationships and those equitable relationships. But there's also that sense of, because you've got the that legacy of settler colonialism happening, that you've automatically got that unequal power dynamic, and that dominant versus exploited for want of a better word, communities, whether you think that in conducting research, there's a responsibility not just to go to the building of equitable relationships, but to go that one step further and to build empowering relationships, or try to turn that power imbalance on its head and put make sure that there's more power in the hands of the communities.
If I could just respond.
Go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the most important things that I've been taught, had the privilege to have been taught over these years, is understanding one of the most important things in working in community is knowing how to hold your place in and being fluid in being able to do that. So sometimes your place is to be the technical expert at the table in a negotiation. Other times your place is actually to leave the room, to exclude yourself from the conversation. Right now I'm co-PI on a customary law project, and even though people know me very, very well in the community, it doesn't matter. When I'm in the room, it's a different kind of conversation, because I bring with me all of the good and the bad of who I am and my background into that conversation, and that shifts it changes it. So I excluded myself from this group of meetings, and people were able to just have different kinds of conversations, and they knew that I would see the results of those conversations, so they were quite open to me reading them after the fact. But it created that. It was just it was more than a gesture. It's just a really important thing to do in creating those equitable relationships.
Thank you, Tanya and Tara, for your comments, and Reina for your reactions. I think you're making me think on how my experiences also in the field have been, and also how I see clashes in the results. Like sometimes people work with us, and not necessarily for the reasons we think they are working with us. I've been asked many times when I'm doing research if I'm gonna give them, or that comes from the government, and they will get like special incentive. But I think like framing everything in such a way that aligns with what we want, but also what we think like they want and achieve, it's really hard. And that's why we need to build like all these trust relationships and long-standing relationships, because then you will be able to, like, I would say, work towards common goals. But it's for me, it's really interesting to see how all this goes. And I think also just going back to the luminary experience, which I enjoyed a lot, because I think the way we can enrich many of these dialogues is precisely bringing more perspectives. I wanted to ask something to Pamela, because I also know she has quite some experience writing proposals and working with Indigenous peoples. How the process has been for you, because we haven't like heard anything from you, and I would like some of your reflections.
Yeah, sorry, I've been sitting quietly, but I just wanted to give everyone a space, to put forward their contributions. One thing that I think we have not covered, at least very explicitly, is, and that always comes up in my work with Indigenous communities at different points of the process, is the issue of sustainability, right? So, for example, I've had a lot of conversations about priorities, coming from, being led from the community. And, again and again, I keep, receiving this feedback that, we don't just want training, we don't just want, non-traditional outputs in the sense of flyers, of briefs, or artistic productions, but we are concerned about the sustainability of, what is your research bringing long term, and how can we sustain this over time? And we've had a lot of conversations trying to negotiate, and find ways of, making our research, results sustainable, but also given the limitations that we have from funders, which are very, very strict in many cases. So for example, we've worked around things like trying to build social enterprises, for example, giving a small funds, given the restrictions that we have with the fundings, trying to support communities in, developing their own enterprises and, connecting that with the research. So trying to find this kind of like non-traditional research outputs, which are even more non-traditional than flyers or like, outputs in the research sense, so, and this opens up also to, the luminary experience and, thinking, breaking also this polarization that we are working in a research only space between, researchers and, indigenous communities and indigenous researchers as well. But, we're doing this research for a purpose, right? For an impact. So how we get there, thinking about how, we can blend in, what we call traditional research, with more, like advancing science and knowledge and blending knowledges, but also thinking about, the societal impact and what are those avenues that we can try and navigate ourselves with, with the restrictions that are imposed, by the systems that we're working in. And that's something that, I always try to think about, and I'm always trying to be creative with the way that, we build our work plans, and we use the very little budgets that we have available. So I don't know, I would like to hear from, everyone, how you navigate that kind of tension, or, what kind of avenues or strategies, you have, had experience with in terms of, making sure, the impact is sustainable and you are, building something in the community that is not just, actionable research, let's say. I'm gonna stop there.
Anyone that would like to share? Tara, Sarah, I think you were describing how in Ecuador, if I'm recalling well, that you had a long-standing relationship, but you also talk about methodological change. I don't know to know. Tara, I see your mic on. Please go ahead.
Yeah. Thank you, Tanya. Just wanted to share our reflection of implementing certain research projects. And because we are an NGO, our research projects are applied in nature. For us, those research projects need to have a concrete impact on the community. So what we feel is that if you have a hybrid research team, for example, if you involve the local practitioners in designing the research project, and especially thinking through the question of what is the purpose of the research. Yeah, this question of what is the purpose of the research and how will the findings be used. These are two questions in which we feel the involvement or engagement of practitioners from the local context is very important, because we feel when we think about impact pathways and impact pathways which will respond to the needs of the community, it is the practitioners who will have a better nuanced understanding of what those impact pathways should be. So we feel one way in which we can think about impact and sustainability is by engaging the practitioners from that particular context. Yeah, so these are my 2 cents.
Thank you, Tara. Anyone else that would like to share how they go about the sustainability of the projects, or how they deal with this tension, like Pamela was mentioning? No more hands? Okay, Tanya, go ahead, please.
Just a very quick example. I know that what we try and do is try and build up projects that make stepwise contributions to bigger sort of policy agendas or bigger economic development agendas. So kind of looking at how can individual projects provide outcomes that lead to this bigger. So for example, this customary law project, we're looking to have a customary law charter that will guide resource development activity in the whole of this particular First Nation territory, and that the line managers from all of the different government agencies would then, through the UNDRIP implementation, adhere and sort of build their policy and their on-the-ground management of resources in adherence to these big principles that are laid out from this customary law document. And so we've had the customary law project, we've got another negotiation with resource managers, we've got some food security projects that are going on, we've got some work in forest gardens and with historical ecology and archaeology, and those are all adding components to this bigger agenda.
Thank you, Tanya, Tara. Someone else that would like to provide a last intervention, because then I think I'm going to hand over to Pamela again, because we need to close, I think, this panel soon too. Or anyone else from the audience that want to have a final intervention?
On anything, yeah, not that we were just discussing.
Okay, I think it's back to you, Pamela.
Okay, great. Thank you so much, everyone, for your inputs, your discussions. It's great to to have these spaces to discuss these very important topics, and to have people from just all over the world. It's really gold. So I thank you, the DSA conference, also for lending us this space to talk. And I just want to say finally that we've been exploring with Tanya the possibility of having a special issue. Of course, it's going to be open, so we will, once we work with a journal. We are currently talking to Elsevier. So once we have some more details, we will share them with you. But we are having some conversations with editors about this possibility. We think there's a lot that still needs to be done on this space, but it's great to see that there's a critical mass emerging from very different parts of the world, that it's moving the process in what I think is the right direction. And it's been so nice to meet you all, and I hope we keep in touch. And if you'd like to share with the group via email your latest what you're up to with your research, any achievements, anything you'd like to share, I think everybody would love to hear about how things are going. And I hope we find more opportunities in the future to continue the conversation, to continue working on this space, and to hopefully have a brighter future, and with more more engaging, more meaningful partnerships, and obviously and hopefully more impact on the ground. So I think from my side, a big thank you to everyone. Everyone, all the co-conveners, Michael, Sarah, Tanya, Bhaskar, all the presenters, thank you so much for your contributions. And that's all from me. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, Pamela. Thanks, everybody. Wonderful.
Okay, have a lovely day and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.